Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast. Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Nick Garcia. Coach Garcia is one of the leading high school coaches in the country. He has served as a strength coach and throws coach at Notre Dame High School in Sherman Oaks, California since 2003. As of 2018, he has coached 17 boys over 55 feet in the shot put, using both the spin and glide techniques. He has also coached 2 girls over 49 feet. In total, he has produced 60 CIF finalists, 5 CIF champions, and 10 state qualifiers. Garcia was also an active shot putter himself. As a student at California State University Northridge, Garcia was a 2-time Big Sky Conference champion in the shot put. In 10 years of post-collegiate training, he increased his personal best to 18.35 meters. Garcia has a bachelor's and master's degree in Kinesiology, IAAF Level 5 certification, CSCS certification, and USA Weightlifting credentials. Coach Garcia is also an experienced presenter on both strength training and throws training. He is a faculty member for the Gambetta Athletic Improvement Network and has presented at the Canadian National Throws Conference, LA84 Advanced Clinic, and multiple courses and clinics for both the World Athletics Center and HMMR Media. Garcia has also consulted on the athletic development topics of professional teams in rugby and was the NHS SCA State and Regional Coach of the Year. So welcome to the show, Coach.
Thank you very much. We talked a little bit about the bio at the beginning. Martin's bio is a little old. That was a long time ago as far as statistics go. So we got a little bit more CIF champions, some more state champions. So I'm gonna have to get Martin to change that bio up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's always increasing every year with what you've learned and then the new athletes that come in.
It's I've been to be successful as a coach, you have to also have very good athletes. So I've been fortunate to have a number of really good athletes, as far as the last number of years go. I think we're up to maybe, I want to say between 18 and 21 CIF champions. So, we're real proud of that. And, the more you're successful with, and you have your good athletes, that's why you're successful, the more athletes want to come to your school. So, or to be coached by you. So good athletes, breed good athletes. You know what I mean? Like it brings in more. So, that helps. You got to have good athletes to be a successful coach.
Well, as we were talking this week and getting ready for this, I'd listened to a few podcasts and that brought the conversation of Husker Power, Boyd Epley influence. And you said you was running metabolic circuits for high school football players. So I was kind of wondering what led you down that road.
Well, believe it or not, when I was in high school, I wanted to be a strength and conditioning coach and a PE teacher. And my influence was by my high school coach named Richard Adams. And back then, in 1994, 95, 96, I graduated in 97. I went to St. Francis High School in Mountain View, and we're a perennial powerhouse in the Bay Area as far as football goes. And that's why I always wanted to go there. Now, back then, high school wasn't as far as advanced as it is now as far as having strength coaches and lifting. But there was a few of us that always trained and lifted hard with Coach Adams. And back then he used the BFS, bigger, faster, stronger thing. But programming has always fascinated me. And so I kind of delve into it. And, at the time, Nebraska was rolling. They had it rolling back then. And you had Tommy Frazier and you had Scott Frost and you had those guys during that era, and they were smashing people. The fullback, Joel Makovica, all these kind of Nebraska names that maybe other fans may not know, or normal college football fans that I remember still. And it fascinated me. So we had a Nebraska coach come recruit some of our players not too long ago. And I said, hey, coach, check this out. I have the original 1993 Make the Play program that was sent out with a flyer that had a Come to Nebraska Strength Clinic for, high school athletes. And I still have that flyer. And I said, here, check this out. You can show Coach Epley this. And it was a program that opened up, and it folded open, and it had the Nebraska weight room, that opened up, and it said, make the play, right? And so I still have that to this day. And I was always fascinated with it because they were smashing people. And I wanted to learn more about strength and conditioning. So that at the time, that's who the people were that were at the cutting edge. And what I do as a coach is every year I try to go someplace where they have it rolling, where they're having a good number of years in a row, and I try to learn from them. And so at that point, during that time, I was in high school, I knew they had it rolling, and I wanted to learn from the best. So that's how it brought me to that program, and made me a Nebraska fan. But what led me to do metabolic circuits is, in my mind, in the past, I've done a bunch of different programs. I've tried it all. I'm a very open-minded. I'm thinking that, like, you have coaches who believe, oh, you got to do the Olympic lifts. You coaches, you don't need the Olympic lifts. Well, we do it all. We do Olympic lifts sometimes. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we get our explosive steps in doing plyos and throwing med balls and things like that. So I'm not one of those guys where you have to do that or you don't have to do that, etc. But in my opinion, we've had really, really good results using metabolic circuits of, putting mass on and whatnot, using that system. And that's why we continually go back to it. And I modify it here and there as far as what I think is necessary. I don't have the push-pull machine that they have. I really like that machine. Now, we have anchor trainers, or Anchor, however you want to pronounce that. And you can set them up in a way where you can get that done, but not in mass production, right? So we do some different things, some different types of twisting at that point when we get to that point of the metabolic circuit. But that circuit is, in my mind, is super efficient. It's only 36 minutes long, depending if you're doing 3 sets or 2 sets. 2 sets is like 22 or 27, I believe it is. And kids get strong, and people don't talk about, or they think, oh, you can't develop mental toughness and stuff. Well, you may not be able to develop it. You may be born with it, but with this circuit, you're going to be able to tell who has it, right? So that's why I like the metabolic circuit. That's why we continually go back to it. And we have a number of 500-pound squatters every year, so it works.
Now, I was kind of wondering on that because programming that, do you need a certain level of conditioning in your athletes? I mean, a metabolic circuit, if you're really pushing the tempo, is pretty intense.
Yeah, so I don't do it with the freshman players and even the beginner sophomore players. However, we do a form of it so they kind of get bred into how it works. And so what I mean by that is every athlete that comes into my program, we have what we call a foundation phase. And the foundation phase is based upon doing movements with kettlebells and dumbbells. And what I mean by that is when we're doing, say, an explosive type day or a lower body type day, we'll do dumbbell jump strokes to kind of teach the posture and the first pull and the clean. Then we'll do dumbbell high pulls, which will teach them how to shrug and pull. And then we'll do some one-arm snatches, and we'll do some goblet squats with kettlebells, and so on. So we're working all the movements that we're going to work on in the future with the barbell, but we're doing it in an unintimidating fashion. Meaning, a lot of kids. I remember when I was first time I ever saw Olympic barbell and how thick it was. I'm like, man, this is a big thing. When I was 8th grade, 9th grade, I've only was ever used to seeing the standard 1-inch type weights. I mean, that's all I was exposed to when I was in junior high and whatnot, and knew about. So a lot of kids could come in kind of intimidated in the weight room, and so especially the females who may not have any experience with that. And so we use kettlebells and dumbbells to start with, and then we move on to what we call a strength endurance phase or power endurance phase, but however you want to work capacity. Let's call it work capacity. And so we'll hit some dumbbell complexes and leg circuits here. Same thing, dumbbells and leg circuits are either body weight or you're wearing a vest. So we're developing a high capacity to do a lot of work. And then after that, we move into more traditional learning how to do the Olympic lifts, learning how to do the normal powerlifting type stuff, squat, hex bar deads, and bench press. Now, what I do during the foundation and work capacity phases is I microdose the Olympic lifts. What I mean is a lot of times we'll get done in 35, 40 minutes doing our actual program. The last 15 minutes, I'm going to teach them where I want their posture to be in the Olympic lift. Basically, the cueing, weight on heels, shoulders back, chest out, bend your knees 2 inches, and then we'll go through the motions of the Olympic lift. So if I microdose that for 8 weeks during our foundational work capacity phase, by the time they get to the 9th week and we start our Olympic lifting, their pulling technique is very, very good because we've done so many pulls with the dumbbells. Their positioning and posture is so good because we microdose that stuff every single day. And people say, well, it takes a lot to teach you Olympic lifts. Not if you microdose it every day for 8 weeks or every workout for 8 weeks. Then you move into that, right? So not till they're a high-level sophomore or juniors and seniors do we hit that metabolic circuit. And if we do a version of it as a freshman, what they'll do is they'll do it with kettlebells and they'll do it with dumbbells. So those of you who are not familiar with the metabolic circuit, basically you have 9 exercises and 3 exercises. The first 3 are always leg movements. And then the next 3 or the next 6 are push-pull, alternate. So an example of doing it with a freshman type class would be a goblet squat, followed by a kettlebell RDL, followed by a Bulgarian split squat holding kettlebells, followed by a dumbbell bench, followed by a inverted row or a gorilla row or a one-arm row. And then you just go push-pull from there. And the last 2 exercises are a bicep choice and a tricep choice. And so they'll do, bench dips, or they'll do tricep, some kind of tricep kickback, and the bicep choice, and just do some hammer curls or some socket curls, something like that. So anyway, that's how we go about doing it.
Now, do you use complexes like you talked about that earlier to start paving the way? Because you can really hit a very similar to a metabolic circuit with the dumbbell complex, but still achieve everything you want and be able to manage it a little bit better.
It is. So my dumbbell complexes and leg circuits, they come from Vern Gambetta. And basically the dumbbell complex is a push-pull circuit. And you go dumbbell high pull, dumbbell alternate press overhead, dumbbell front squat, and then a dumbbell row. And so however long it takes you to complete that circuit, usually it's between 46 and 55 seconds, you rest. So it's 1-to-1 work rest ratio. And so they'll get, 3 to 4 circuits done in 5 to 8 minutes, let's say, right, with the rest, or 6 to 10 minutes with the rest in between. So usually you're going with a partner. So you just go back and forth with that, and that gets your heart rate going and gets you, your work. You develop that work capacity that you need for the dumbbell complex. For the metabolic circuit. And then with that same day, we go right into a leg circuit. And there's 3 different versions of leg circuits. There's mini leg circuits, half leg circuits, and full leg circuits. A full leg circuit is 20 bodyweight squats, 10 lunges each side, 10 step-ups each side, and 10 jump squats. We do normally half leg circuits when we start, and that's 10 squats, 5 lunges each side, 5 dynamic step-ups each side, and 5 jump squats. And what that is we kind of have a progression depending on how long we stick with this cycle. The first week, you got 3 sets of that with 1 minute rest in between. The next week, we have 4 sets, 1 minute in between. And next week, we have 5 sets with 1 minute in between. If we do a 4th week, which we typically do, we go 3 sets with no rest in between. So basically, it's squat, lunge, dynamic step up, jump squat, and right back into squatting it. Now, I will tell you this, with those leg circuits, I did an experiment one time where we squatted heavy once a week traditionally, and we did a leg circuit once a week. Now, during that leg circuit, you have a huge amount of time under tension on your legs. So even though you may only be using a 50-pound sandbag or a 25-pound sandbag on your back, you're doing like 350 reps if you're doing 5 sets of that. A full leg circuits, we had a kid who was 160 pounds, rock bottom squat 525 at 525. Using that type of program, squatting heavy once a week and doing the leg circuit once a week. So it works really effectively. And yes, it does prepare you to do not only heavy weight, but it also prepares you to do a lot of work for the metabolic circuit.
I've heard Zach Duvall talk about it just a little bit. And when they were kind of ironing out the details of all that, they were able to pull a lot of their running from the program as far as conditioning went. Right. Do you notice that the kids don't have to be ran quite as much to have them in football shape with the metabolic circuits?
Well, yes, that's part of it. And the first couple times you do it, first couple weeks is like kind of miserable for them. Like they're trying to get their bearings of what their weight should be. And typically when you're doing the sets of 10, you kind of want to be at 65, 70, 75% roughly of your max. Well, by the time they get to bench press, even though the bench press has nothing to do with your lower body, those first 3 leg exercises, they get crushed on the bench press because they're just wore out from squatting. And even though it has nothing to do with your chest, they're just wore out from it. And so they develop a high level of conditioning really fast. Now, I've always been a proponent on the running end is that if you're practicing right, your conditioning, you don't need as much conditioning anyways, because you want to be specific to what your sport's doing. You see kids go out there, I'm going to go run 2 miles and get ready for football. Well, You got 25 seconds between plays, and each play is 7 seconds roughly. So it makes a lot of sense to go, 7 to 10 second burst with 25 second rest. That's how you get shape from your sport, right? So on that end, I have never really been a big proponent of a bunch of running during practices, football practice, and 1 hour conditioning afterwards. I feel that you can get it done if you practice right and doing it the right thing in the weight room.
You kind of touched on it right there, but to dig in a little deeper, analyzing a sport and then understanding what the weight room demand is. As far as at the high school level, will you kind of look at each sport individually to see what that sport needs in the weight room, or do you see a deficiency overall in your athletes and it's pretty much the same?
Well, I absolutely do see it differently. Now, as a high school strength coach, it is my personal philosophy, how I do things, that I need to prepare them to be at the next level. And so every strength coach at the next level may have a different philosophy. So I want my athletes to know how, even if they don't do Olympic lifts to the next level, I want them to know how to clean. I want them to know how to squat. I want them to know how to do all those movements. So they're prepared when they get to college. I get so many letters and emails saying, "Hey, coach, I was so prepared, and I didn't have to lift with the beginners. I got to lift with the more veteran type people after a couple sessions because they knew I knew what I was doing." That's great. That's my goal. As far as looking at the demands of the sport. So let's take football, for example, since we're on that subject. An offensive lineman has to move 300-pound people as fast as possible, right? Like if you're slow and and heavy, you may be able to move something, but not as fast as it needs to be moved, right? And so they need to be able to move large amount of weight in the weight room quickly. Like if you take a kid who moves 100 kilos in the clean at 1.5 meters per second, and another kid who moves 100 kilos, they're moving the same weight, but it takes him, he only moves it at 0.8 meters per second. You're always going to take the guy who can move it at 1.5 meters per second, right? Because they're moving that way faster. That's our goal. Now you take a volleyball player, their objective is not to move 300-pound people. Their ball is very tiny. They got to move fast in a small court. So basically, with for example, the female volleyball players, we do only strictly velocity-based training. So when we go in, I say I want the squat bar to move at this rate. I want the clean to move at this rate. I want the bench to move at this rate. This is what I want. So that's how I delineate between the teams as far as how heavy we're going that day, etc. Now, we do use velocity-based training with football during in-season, but out of season, we talked about doing metabolic circuits and things like that. And the bottom line is there's a time and place for everything. And for them in season, we move everything fast. Out of season, that's when we kind of move a little bit slower, but we're going heavy. Hopefully that makes a little sense.
Yeah, I think you set that up well. And then kind of what you said in there, about two guys pulling the same weight, whoever pulls it faster is the strongest. That's what Louis Simmons used to say, strength's measured in time. So obviously the faster you can get your guys with the heavier weight, the better they're going to be prepared. But then I also understand in volleyball, it's not about strength in that football aspect. So you have to make the changes you need.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is in football you have to move heavyweight. In order to move heavyweight fast, you have to learn how to move heavyweight. And so that's why we do that with the heavyweight in football. In volleyball, or for example, even baseball, right? The baseball is the bats, at most 30 ounces, 31 ounces. That's what they got to swing, right? And they got to be able to move that bat fast. And so we don't necessarily need to, do heavy power cleans and things like that. We need to do fast power cleans or fast Olympic lifts, whatever type of variation we're doing, but we don't need to do, 150 kilos in order to hit a ball far.
Obviously, you've had a lot of success with throws. So I'll kind of start heading down that way through, just luck or whatever it is. I ended up with a gym full of throwers. So I'm a little behind the curve, and now I'm playing catch up. So me and one of my athletes got to talking about this and kind of looking at his broad jump. I think his broad jump's lacking a little. He's a shot putter. So I said I would bring the question to you. What plyos do you see that carry over well to the pit, to shot putters?
Well, I'll tell you this, is I have a progression we use throughout the season. And so the way I run my system for my throwers who are training traditionally, not using Dr. Bondarchuk's system, but traditionally, and the difference between those two is a multi-sport athlete can do Dr. B's system. Only athlete can. And so when we're training multi-sport athletes, which most of them are, what we'll do is the first 4 weeks of training, we'll do what we call a high volume, number of touches on the ground, and a plethora of different types of jumps. And so what we'll do is, for example, my first 4-week training block is called volume. And so everything is high in volume as far as reps, sets in the weight room and on the field. And so a jumping circuit is what we'll do. And the first jumping circuit is we'll do what we call star jumps. And we'll do 10 reps of that. Then we'll go right to power skips for height. After power skips for height, we'll do speed skaters. And speed skaters are exactly as they sound. They look like a speed skater when they go back and forth. Then we're going to do power skips for distance. Then we're going to do ankle hops, single leg hops forward, single leg low amplitude, meaning we're going real stretching heel toe, really working the ankle flexion. I'll explain why in a second. And then we'll finish off with single leg butt kicks. Now we have a variety of different jumps there. You have single leg jumps. You have different jumps in different planes, on the frontal plane, on the sagittal plane, etc. Now, if you take a look, I think a lot of coaches will agree with this who listen, is when you're teaching a kid how to rotate, spin, do a half turn, wheel, whatever you want to call it, step backs, there's a bunch of different names. As soon as they get to that position, they'll collapse onto their heel. And my hypothesis for that is that we don't see kids outside riding bikes anymore. So they're not pedaling anymore. So their shin and that area and their calves aren't as strong as they normally are. So they just collapse right down because they're not used to doing that type of stuff. So all these little jumps that we're doing, low amplitude single leg jumps forward and things like that are meant to strengthen those areas. So when we do start getting better at technique, they can stay on the ball of their foot. After we do that, the next 4 weeks, we just do like box jumps or jumps over small hurdles, things like that, make it a little more advanced. And then finally, the last 4 weeks, we start combining things. We call that our neural training, the last 4 weeks. And we do a forward jump over a hurdle with a front heave for distance with a med ball, and a 2 box jumps with a back heave with a med ball, things like that. We combine things. Or we'll do a heave for height with a med ball and a sprint as fast as we can forward and see how far we can get before the ball hits. And so those are the types of plows that we're doing. So we have a high volume of jumps. Then our next phase, our strength development phase, we go to box jumps, which may be no more than 25 touches or 25 box jumps during it. So, and I call it jumps in ascending order. I mean, we have a box at 6 inches, a box at 12 inches, a box at 18, 24, and 30. You go over as many as you can, and then if you can't get over the last one, you just jump on top of it and jump down. And after that, we do our combo jumps like I talked about. So those are the progression of jumps that we use, and we do it in multiple planes. And so that's what's important to me, is developing the overall all-around athlete rather than just a thrower or just a jumper or just a sprinter. We want to develop the overall athlete.
And I was kind of looking at this too, sprinting for throwers, you know, not necessarily 100 yards or whatever, but building up the neurological pathways. How much sprinting will your throwers do?
We do sprinting, and I do it in the same pattern we were talking about just right now, as far as you have your high volume stuff. So the high volume stuff we're doing like strides. We'll have a hard high volume workout, and then we'll finish off with some 100-meter buildups or 100-meter strides, right? And then that's kind of the first 4 weeks. The next 4 weeks is a lower volume phase, strength development. And so we're going to do more like some flying 30s. So for those of you who don't know what flying 30s are, you have a cone set at the goal line, a cone set at 20, and a cone set at 50. By the time you get from the goal line to this first cone on the 20, we want you at full speed, and you're at full speed for 30 yards. So we'll do our flying 30s, or what I want to call, I guess we call that max velocity type stuff. And then at the very end, our neural training, we're doing sprints from unusual starting position. So I might have somebody start on their stomach, and I'll say, you go on first sound. So it could be a whistle, it could be a whisper, it could be a go really loud, but they're starting from an unusual starting position, and they're getting up and going for 5 yards as hard as they can. And so you could call that your acceleration phase, right? So most sprint coaches have an acceleration day, they have max velocity day, they have a tempo day, speed endurance day. Well, the thrower, we kind of do it in cycles. We have our kind of more of our strength or speed endurance type day weeks for the first 4 weeks, and we have our max velocity the next 4 weeks, and then we have our neural or our acceleration the last 4 weeks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that would kind of build up into where I'm heading next. So we've got some throwers here that have been throwing through the summer, and their numbers have just went through the roof. And, the Missouri State track meet wasn't that long ago, roughly a month and a half, right? But they were doing running events as well. So how much will a multi-discipline track athlete lose in their throws because of running the 400 or running the 300 hurdles? Do you see any of that? And do you have to allow for it?
Well, not so much in the running. I have a girl, state champion of the discus, Aja Johnson. She's a high jumper as well. She high jumps. She's not very tall. She's only like 5'2" or 5'3", but she scores points at dual meets and whatnot. And because of that, I won't have her do any plyos that we just talked about. She doesn't do any plyos because she gets enough of her jumping done when she high jumps. So I feel that we don't need to do that or periodize that into the system. So my philosophy is that I am sure that within the same day, it'll definitely take it out of you, especially depending on how much recovery time that you have, right? So if you go right from the 400 right to the throws, then you're probably not going to be throwing very well. I wouldn't imagine, So it's hard for me to say. I don't have a lot of experience with the sprinting part, but the jumping part I do. And I think what has to happen there, in my personal opinion, is that the athlete has to kind of see what they're best in and make the other things secondary. And so if you're throwing the shot put, make sure that gets done first. I know there's an event order and whatnot, but if you're running, a 4x1, okay, as soon as you get done with the 4x1, that's probably not going to take so much out of you. Get right to the shot or the discus right away. But I think that regardless of what meet it is, wherever you can score higher in, you should probably put more emphasis on that. And if you don't, I understand that you have the team aspect, but there's also the individual aspect for the athlete. And what's going to benefit the athlete most is to be successful in what they're best at, rather than kind of spreading them thin all over the place. But that's the head coach's decision to make. And so that's all I really have to say about that, because I don't have a lot of experience with that.
You use both systems. You use a traditional system and you use a Bondarchuk system. We can get into the Bondarchuk system a little bit deeper, but going to the traditional system first, are you looking at any sort of peaking method like you would in the Bondarchuk system, or you just kind of got to play it as it lies?
Well, looking at both systems, is the Bondarchuk system like you peak when the athlete's body wants to adapt and peak. When you're using a traditional system, you are telling the system, the athlete's body, when it should be peaking. And so, absolutely, like I said, I was very, very fascinated with programming. I always have been. And so, my thoughts was, when I was a young coach, and back in 2002 and 2003, I went to USA Weightlifting, a seminar, and got my level 1 certification. And they taught us a basic program of how they do the Olympic lifting. And I was back then thinking, well, if they have to be ready for one meet and they PR at that meet, same kind of energy system that shot putters use. You have, 6 attempts. They have, whatever attempts they have with the weightlifting thing. Why won't this work? This has to work, because it's the same thing. And so now you have to understand that we're not Olympic lifters, so we're not going to go in and squat every day. We're not going to, clean every day. But the general programming of how it's periodized should work. And so I started doing that. And I started working like a champ the first 2 or 3 years. Then we started getting really good, and I was like, well, we got to be able to hold this peak. So how do I hold this peak? So the system I learned from Coach Conroy, he's out of Idaho, he's a big lifting coach. So I messaged him, I said, hey, Coach, how can I hold this peak, if we have a number of meets in a row? And he told me how to do it. And we started doing it, and we developed this distinct patterns, just like you do on the Dr. B system. And so here in California, we have the league meet, we have CIF prelims, CIAF finals, masters meet, and state meet. So you got to be ready for 5 meets in a row. Now, if you have a crappy league, then 4 meets in a row. But we have a really good league, so there's a chance you may not get out of your league if you don't hit the hard mark or get in the top 3. So we got to be ready. So I set it up so on the 13th week of our program, that would be the 13th week, and boom, we hit PRs. The next week we would maintain, and we would be good enough to move on from the prelims to the finals. Final CIF finals, we throw really well and sprint really fast because I use the same program for the sprinters and jump really high. And then the masters meet, if we're fortunate enough to qualify on the masters meet, they throw far enough and do well enough to move on to the state meet. The state meet with PR. So it's worked like a champ for me for 15 plus years. If you look at my history at the state meet, my kids are always throwing their best throws at the state meet. And so absolutely we use that periodization system. And then people are saying, well, we got to deal with football. We got to deal with sports, things like that. Well, I am the head strength coach, and so I work with football as well. And now to make both worlds happy, you have to look at the track schedule and say, well, we're not going to run fast and throw far and jump high and jump far every meet. Like, we have to pick the specific ones. And so there are times where my guys are blasted on their volume week. And the way our weeks work, we have base week, volume week, unload week, and performance week. And when they're blasting the volume week, they're probably not going to perform too well because that's part of the deal. Every year, Arcadia comes around, and it's on the same week. And it's the volume week. And every year, you look at our history at Arcadia, we're not good. We get beat. And if we have a special athlete, then yes, we're still in the mix. And this year, like Aja won Arcadia discus, not so good in the shot, but won the discus. But when it comes to the state meet, we're always ready. And whether your head coach needs you to be ready for a dual meet or not, well, what do you want to be ready for? You want to be a CIF champion, or you want to win a league? What's more important? And so you have to ask that to yourself. And if you start backing off for certain meets, you're never going to have a true peak because you didn't do the work in order to have that true peak. So absolutely, we have a system, and that system I believe in 100%. Going back to the metabolic sugar, which we talked about, the difference that I use, they train 4 days a week. We train 2 days a week. And so we have a strength-based day and we have an explosive-based day. I learned this from John Smith at Ole Miss. He's a really good coach, very successful. And he's always preached about lifting 2 days a week. And no one believed him because his kids were so strong. And so every year I go find some place that who has a role and who's done a really good job as a coach that I want to learn from. I fly out there and I see what they do. And it was no BS. He did exactly what he does. And so we train 2 days a week now. And when we hired a new football coach, he's like, 2 days a week. I'm like, trust me, man. And so as soon as he saw our numbers and saw how it worked and how we had very few injuries and how guys were recovering and felt good, 100% buy-in. And it's worked even better than, lifting 4 days a week because the kids aren't blasted.
Let's keep going down the rabbit hole we were talking about on peak and then kind of what you're talking about there. Do you find that as athletes mature and or get a little further in your system that they hold peak better than your younger athletes?
I do. I think their experience level is what helps that, right? Once you see it happen for the first time, they're going to believe the next time, and they're going to believe the following time that this is going to happen. So I think psychologically, that's what really helps. Now, we'll tell you this, is that when they're a multi-sport athlete in track and football or basketball or whatever, we always use a traditional system up until their senior year. When their senior year, football season's over, we go to the Dr. B system. Now, I've done it where traditional, we've had success, and then we go to the Dr. B system, we have huge success their senior year. And I've done it where we stay traditional, stay traditional again. It's not as successful. And I did a lot of research on it, and part of the reason is, from what my opinion, my hypothesis, is that there's a kind of a theory out there that says every year you have to do more volume than you did the year before in order to be successful. And so when you start doing Dr. B system, even though you may not be lifting heavy, the volume is way up. And so that, I think, is what has enabled our success on kids who go traditional, Dr. B, because of the volume jump, versus traditional, where we may not be as good their senior year and hold a peak as well, or even peak as well, because that volume is the same as it was the year before, rather than being much more. Does that make sense?
listening to like Derek Evely talk and some of the Bonder check system, that led me to wonder, along with the maturity factor and the traditional training, if you see athletes move from like a 1 to a 2 to a 3, or as far as athletes classification system and how long they hold form, or do you kind of at the high school level, do you kind of see them at a 1 or a 2, or do you get that exceptional 3 that can hold form a long time?
I force, Derek and I have talked a lot about this. You find a way to hold form a long time, right? Did you guys talk about the maintenance phase, how you terrace the maintenance phase and whatnot?
No, we actually did not get too much into that. I actually have some questions for you because you did some writing on it, so we can get into that for sure.
Yeah. So, as far as the 1 to 2 to 3 type athlete, you have one athlete that will kind of drop off and then come back up. Then you have the other athlete who'll kind of stay the course and all of a sudden hit a big peak. And then you have an athlete that just peaks, keeps going up the whole time, right? That's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of my athletes drop off and then come back up again. Now, in order to hold that taper or hold that peak, you kind of have to have a really good idea of their pattern and what sessions they hit peak at. And so right now I'm working with a girl named Hope Gordon, who came back from college, and she was one of my high school athletes, and the Dr. B system worked flawlessly for her. She's gone to more of a traditional system of college, and she hasn't been as good since she was in high school. So she kind of came back. We started doing that system, and right now she's at peak form, and her peak form is between 16 to 23 sessions, right? So I know what that is from her past, and she's kept that. Now, when she gets to 16 to 23, like right now, she's in perfect peak form. She's at 22. Say, okay, I know that there's going to be a drop off here around 24, 25. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go full maintenance right now. Now, there's 2 types of maintenance cycles. The first style is every 2 weeks you switch everything. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Dr. B system, you have competitive exercise, which is the CE. You have a specific development exercise, which is the SDE. You have the specific preparatory exercise, which is using all the same muscles you use in the event, but it doesn't mimic the event's movement. Then you have a general preparation circuit or exercise circuit, GPE circuit, and that's a 1 twist, 1 back exercise, 1 frontal plate exercise, and 1 abdominal exercise. And we do that in circuit fashion. So now the first option is to change all those right away. Like when she gets to 21 or 22 and we know she's at peak, we're going to change all those. And every 2 weeks, we're going to change all those and we're going to hold our form. And that has worked perfect as well as far as holding form. Now, the kind of new way we've done it that works better in my mind is we call it terrace. And so when she gets to session 22 and we know she's at peak form, the first thing we're going to change is her competitive exercise. So if she's throwing 4 kilo and a 5 kilo in training, we might switch it to a 4 kilo and a 3 kilo in training for 2 sessions. Everything else is going to stay the same. After 2 sessions of that, we're going to keep those, the 3K and the 4K, but now we're going to change the SDE, specific development exercise. So instead of doing a kettlebell stand throw, she may do a landmine press for a specific development exercise. So now we're at 4 sessions like that. Everything else stays the same. When we get to session 5, we're going to switch her first specific preparatory exercise with the clean. We'll switch that to snatch for two sessions, let's say. So now we're at session 6. After session 6, we go to 7 and 8. We're going to keep all the first 3 things I just talked about. We're going to change her back squat to a step up. So now after 8 sessions, we have all those new movements. Okay, we're going to go and switch the general preparatory exercise or circuit. And now after 8 to 10 sessions, we have a whole complete new thing, right? And so what we're doing here is we're adding a little bit of stimulus, okay, without adding a whole bunch to screw you up. Just a little bit here and there. We keep adding something new, adding something new, adding something new, adding something new. Then when we get back, okay, to the competitive exercise, we switch those again. We may go back to a heavier one. And we just keep rolling that through the whole maintenance type phase, and they hold form that way. Does that make sense? I know it's complicated, but does that make sense?
Well, what I think I'm getting from that is you could use this almost in an anti way of what Derek discussed on the show a little bit. So the more changes you make, the longer you are to peak.
The longer you hold the peak.
And the longer the longer your peaks take, and then this would be anti. So now the longer you'd be able to hold the peak because your body never adjusts to anything. So it just kind of maintains. Is that kind of how that would work?
Exactly. So during the developmental cycle, so you got your developmental cycle. And so the developmental cycle is the same exercise classifications, your competitive exercise, your specific development exercise, your specific preparatory exercises, and your general preparatory exercises. Now, you do those the same thing every day until you hit peak form. You hit your peak form, okay? So we're doing all those are the exact same thing every day. As soon as we hit our peak form, we may do a few sessions where we know we're at peak. And then right before we know we're going to drop off, or maybe a few sessions before the drop off, if we know our sessions, that's when we start changing little things at a time. And that's why we're able to hold that peak. Does that make more sense?
Yeah. I was kind of putting it together in my head and I wasn't able to put the words with it. But looking back on some of the things we discussed and some of the things I've read, that makes a lot of sense to me because he kind of opened up my eyes a little bit. Like, and I know you work like I think your cycles are like 4 to 6 weeks training normal athletes. And some stuff I'd read, you may have changed that since you wrote that stuff.
You mean traditional style?
Yes. And I know I'm kind of jumping around, but I do have a plan with where I'm going with this, I promise. But so in what we just talked about in a traditional style, if you see a kid not progressing with the others in that 4 to 6 week system, will you keep them in a 4 to 6 week cycle longer? So will you run them like in an 8 or 10 week cycle to help them catch up with the other athletes? So maybe their peaks way out.
In the traditional system or in Dr. B's system?
In the traditional system. So if you got if you got some slow gainers that aren't keeping up with the other kids, and it appears like maybe the change is what's holding them back, I didn't know if you would keep them in a longer cycle.
In that sense, the way I do my cycles that way, no. So that traditional cycle is 13 weeks plus the maintenance is about another 4 to 5 weeks. And the way that works is we have a base week, a volume week, a load week, and a performance week. And then that's block 1, and that's volume. Block 2 is strength development. And so the only thing that changes are the percentages and the reps. The exercises don't necessarily change, the main ones. And so I'm manipulating the volume and the intensity in order to hit our peak, right? I'm not necessarily concerned about as far as how much they're lifting or whatnot. It's just all based off the percentages. Does that make more sense now?
Yeah.
So no matter what, I stick to that plan. Like it's 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, and 13 weeks is our prep week or our competition week, and that's when they should throw their PRs. And then the rest from there is maintenance. And so I'm manipulating the volume and the intensity to hit our peak. And I'm not necessarily worried about where they're at until they get to week 13. So in a sense, it's kind of a gamble, but it works. It's been working well for us. So I'll stick to it.
Okay. So tracking peaks, you're in a high school setting, you have a lot of athletes, you're trying to manage your time, you're trying to manage the data, and you're trying to manage each individual athlete. So how are you able to kind of look at that, especially if you're just putting it in their senior year? When do you start having them get ready, throw implements or whatever that may be, so that you can start looking at how long it takes them to peak?
Well, we're referring to the Dr. B system here. And right now, if they're a track athlete only, right now, we're starting right now as soon as we get back to school. When their sport is over, typically most track athletes do a fall sport, football, volleyball, etc. As soon as that season's over, we start, right? So I got about 7 months. If they get done in November, we got November, December, January, February, March, April, May. And so typically to figure their pattern out, they'll take 2 to 3 months. So, the sooner we can start, the better. So typically November we'll start. By January, I kind of have an idea where they're at and know their pattern. Now, at the same time, we have to figure out, the whole point of the Dr. B system is to figure out what transfers the best. So do heavy implements transfer the best? Do light implements transfer the best? I've had times at the end of the year where we have 4 athletes in the CIF finals, and 2 of them are on heavy implements, 2 of them are on light implements, because I figured out that these 2 react better to heavy implements, these 2 react better to light implements. So they're going to have completely different developmental cycles because of that.
You're starting to get into some more questions I had. So, because I haven't put all this together in my mind yet. So let's say you start them out on a heavy implement. Will you rotate back to a competition element to see what it did, or are you just tracking the gains they made in that peaking cycle?
So what we'll do is our first developmental cycle, I always go with heavy. Our second developmental cycle, I always go with light. But that competition implement is always involved in the developmental cycle. So let's say developmental cycle number 1, we're going to throw for a high school athlete, a high school boy, we're going to throw a 14-pound shot from the stand. We'll do 6 kilo shots from fulls and 12-pound from fulls. After that developmental cycle ends, we will go to a cleanse phase. And usually the cleanse phase is only a light implement. So I kind of have an idea how to react to that light implement during the cleanse phase. Then the next developmental cycle, we're going to stay with light implements. They may throw a 12-pound, a 5K, and a 10-pound during that next cycle. Throughout those 2, I'm going to kind of have an idea, like, by watching them and what the results are. Because you've got to think about it. Developmental cycle is 15, 16 to 25 sessions or so. So you have about a month to see how they react to both of them. And I say, okay, I kind of get an idea. You threw better when you were throwing the light implement. You threw better when you were throwing the heavy in the developmental cycle. So that's kind of how I figured it out. Now, if we have time for a third cycle where we do a combination of 1 heavy, 1 light, and 1 normal, then we'll do that as well. They may react really well to that as well. So keeping data is the most important thing. For example, me personally, I know for a fact that whenever I threw the 6 kilo in training, I threw the 16-pound shot really far. I also knew in competition, I also knew that when I threw a 20-pound from fulls in training, the first week I would throw the 16 out of my mind. Like, I've never thrown before, but after that first week, I get into such a hole with my rhythm. It would offer that stimulus, that 20-pound shot would offer that stimulus the first week. I get in such a hole with my rhythm that would take me forever to get back to where I was after that week. And so keeping that data is super important to figure out what you react to the best. Not only that, you also know what sessions you're good at. I knew, let's take my thrower, Aja Johnson, for example. I usually know that when you start a new developmental cycle, that between sessions 4 and 6, you're really good. And so we got done with our state meet. She was training traditionally, and we had to get her ready for Nike Nationals. And so we had already held our peak for 17 weeks, or for 5 weeks we held our peak. She PR'd the state meet. That's our goal. So how do I get her ready for football at Nike Nationals? She wants to go. I don't necessarily want her to go, but she wants to go. The college coaches there, etc. So I said, okay, you're a senior now. We're going to Dr. Beat system. So we trained for those 6 weeks, and Derek and I talked heavily about how to do it. And she threw really well. She hit her peak form. Or not peak form, but she hit her best throws during sessions 4 to 6 while she was at the Nike Nationals. So that data is so important to set up your meets and to know how you're going to compete at those meets.
Is it fairly crucial that you get a shot that's significantly different than a competition shot that you're working, so your brain doesn't view it almost as the same? I know Derek talked about this a little bit, and Bondarchuk kind of come up with this, that if your brain doesn't see a difference, you're almost double dipping. So do you really want to kind of figure out where you need to be? Like if you're throwing a 12-pound shot, if a 16 is making you peak too quick, do you see that as the brain sees that as too close of an implement, and then you need to open that up a little bit?
Well, I look at it from a different perspective. I don't believe you can only throw one implement as far as the 12-pound shot. Yeah, like high school guys and even a lot of professionals throw only the 16 or only the 12 or only the 4K. Once you have a good general strength as far as how strong you are in the weight room, that's not going to help you or correlate to helping you anymore in the throwing events, right? How far you throw the 18-pound shot, how far you throw the 6 kilo shot, how far you throw different weighted implements is going to give you that specific strength, exact specific strength, and exact specific speed in order to improve your throwing. And so I look at it from a specific strength, specific speed point of view. Is you're only going to get so much out of the weight room. What you're really going to get most out of is throwing the heavier implement or the lighter implement farther. Does that make sense? So I don't necessarily look at it as far as how your brain's going to react to it. I look at it as far as specific strength versus specific speed. Now, I do use those, how do I say, ideas where we're not going to throw the 6K back-to-back in developmental cycles. We're not going to throw the, 5K back-to-back in developmental cycles. There'll always be, we throw a 5K in one developmental cycle. We're either going to throw a 10-pound in the next developmental cycle if we want to stick with light, or we're going to go to a heavy implement. So I use that idea, but not for the same reasonings that others may use it as far as the brain. You know what I'm saying?
Coming down the chart, you got your CE and you got your SPE and then you got your SDE all the way down, like you just mentioned. How do you decide what lifts are propelling you in your throws as opposed to what implements are propelling you in your throws?
That's a tough question. I think once again, the data is what does it. Now, for me personally, when I was throwing, I hit my big throws when I was doing very light close grip snatches, speed step ups, we call it. I would have my best throws then. When I was doing hex bar deads, things like that, I didn't have good transfer at all. So based off the data of what I'm doing throwing wise, now let's say I threw the 6K very far, or through the 6K in a developmental cycle, let's say. I was doing hex bar deads, and I didn't throw the 16 really far in competitions during that time. But then I did a 6K in another developmental cycle, and I wasn't doing hex bar deads. I was doing speed step-ups. I think the 6K transfers, and what's the difference? The speed step-ups were different than the hex bar dead. So the speed step-ups would show to transfer more for me than the hex bar dead. That's all that data collection is what's most important. Now, how I start athletes off is I think of it as a speed versus strength phases, right? So a strength-based phase, we're throwing all heavy implements, and we're doing cleans, we're doing squats, things like that, heavier type lifts, because squatting is a heavier load than step-ups. Cleaning is a heavier load than snatches. When we go to a more of a speed type phase, then we're throwing light implements, we're doing snatches, we're doing light speed step-ups or something along those lines, or box squats, because they're faster. And so I kind of separate my cycles by strength versus speed based upon the lifts we're doing and what implements we're throwing.
As you've developed all this and looking back over your career, how long did it take you to learn to trust the process and not try to tuck a bunch of stuff in at the end because you were worried you didn't hit it all? Did that happen? Did that happen fairly early on, or is it just something you learned to trust what you were doing?
Like we started off with, is I've always been super fasty with programming, and I don't know if it comes from my pedigree. My coach in college, his name was Glenn McAtee, and Glenn McAtee, without him, I would have never really had an opportunity. I'm 5'7". I was a JC glide shot putter, etc. And I always just kind of did exactly what the coach told me, and I bought into him at 100%. And so when I switched to spin, and I learned how to spin, and he must have saw some kind of talent in me, and he told me, you're going to PR this week because we're tapered to PR. And I did. I'm like, oh, he knows, he's omnipotent, right? He's all-knowing. Next meet, again, like the next outdoor meet, boom, we did it again, okay, at the next conference meet. And so I always bought in 100% because this individual gave me a shot that maybe no one else would have given me a shot. And it worked out for all of us. I was Big Sky champion 2 times, and I threw far and scored points, at the conference meet, etc. So for me personally, it was like I always bought it 100%. Now, the negative of that is that I expected all that from every athlete that I coached. And not everybody does that, or not everybody believes like that. So once you get it, that's why it takes a program a little while to get going. They'll start seeing results, and then they'll start believing. And one of the perfect things this year happened. I told all the sprinters, like, this is the week. This is our performance week. You're gonna run a PR. You're gonna run 41 seconds in the relay. What happened? They ran 41 seconds in the relay. And then I follow that same pattern. Okay, this is another performance week. Okay, this is the state meet. We are tapered better than we've ever been tapered. You're tapered on the track. You're tapered in the weight room. This is what we need to do in the weight room. And you're going to run below 41 seconds. And boom, they ran 40.97. So when you tell them and you believe in yourself and your program, you tell them this is going to happen and it happens, that's when things start to take shape. And that's when athletes start to buy in. And once that happens, then you're always typically going to have buy-in. Even if it's only from 90%, those other 10% will jump in. With 80%, those other 20% will jump in because the majority know that it's going to work out. So, I know that's not a kind of roundabout answer to your question, but based on my experience when I was younger and McAtee gave me a shot and it working out for both of us, I just always bought into what I was being coached to do. And then I expected my athletes to buy into what I'm coaching them to do. And when they did, it worked out and it just kind of snowballs from there. He always told me you could have the greatest coach in the world, but if you don't have any buy-in, you're not going to have really good success. You could have the worst coach in the world, but if you buy into what they're saying, you're going to have more success than the other person who had no belief in their coach who may have been the best in the world.
That kind of gets to it where, maybe if you were in a different situation and your coach didn't have faith and then you didn't have faith in your coach, maybe it would have taken longer for you to get to where you're at. But having the benefit of what you had helps speed up the process.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like I'm in debt to him. I'm in debt to all the coaches who have ever taught me stuff. Like I said, I go around all over the place. And Art Venegas one time told me, and we're close, that you got to be to be a good coach, you got to be a pest. And you got to pester other people and be around all the time and learn all the time. And that's what I am, man. Like I go visit John Smith, Art Venegas, Dan Lang is one of my closest friends, and he's amazing. I learned a bunch from him. Vern Gambetta, Derek, obviously. When he started first doing the Dr. B system, they were doing a training camp at my place and staying at my house. And I was too stupid and young to realize what was going on and didn't learn it then. But I eventually learned it from him. So just learning from all these people and then kind of developing your own system. I owe all that to all the people I've learned from.
I've been thinking about this for a while, and I don't know if it has any carryover whatsoever or not, but you start looking at sprinters and the foot and the ankle, that's the spot that has to carry all of the force that your body's trying to put into the ground. With rowers, how important is that wrist strength, in the same type system? Do you got to develop that wrist where it's got that good flick, but it has the strength that can handle the strength you're putting behind it?
I think that is the most undercoached part of throwing is the finger flick at the end or the release at the end. Now, the coaches who really know how to teach it sometimes have kids with lots of hand problems because they develop how to strike so aggressively and so well that it creates so much force in their wrists and their hand that sometimes they have hand pain and hand problems. Like there was a point where, for me personally, I had a tough time shaking people's hands. I would still do it and squeeze as hard as I could, but it'd be super painful for me because of all the throwing I was doing, heavy implements and normal implements and the volume of throws I was taking. Now, I think you develop it over time. Me personally, you have these different gloves that people are using now and the way they tape their hands and things like that. I guess I'm old school, but I would lose the feel of the shot if I use some kind of device on my hand. So I just sucked it up. When I throw the 20, I would just throw it there, just a boxing wrap. When I threw the 18, same thing. And my hand just adapted to it as far as that goes. But I think just over time, we talked about microdosing at the beginning. Before every practice, we'll do finger flicks. We'll do 10 into the ground, and then we'll do 10 into from our knees. And then we'll do 10 what we call three-step jab throws. And so they place the shot in their neck, and they do a three-step jab delivery and smash it as hard as they can into a net or a wall if it's an indoor shot. And we just work on our arm strength and our arm strike in that manner. The other thing you could do is you could use med balls as well to develop the flick with a med ball. But typically those three things that we do at the beginning, microdose them, that's what kind of helps develop our wrist strength and our arm strength.
I'm kind of I've got notes scattered all over on this, and I appreciate you letting me stumble through these questions. You can obviously tell that I'm fairly new to the system, but I'm really intrigued by it. So when you're programming lifts and you're looking at speeds, what kind of speeds are you looking for in your lifts? Now, I know it's probably going to be determined on the lift, but let's say you're looking at a strength phase. Are you going to program a lift to a little slower speed? Are you going to get down in under 6 meters per second on some of those lifts? What are you kind of looking for to help develop that athlete?
Well, if we're training traditionally, yes, we are. Now, I have charts that I've gotten that for squat, bench, and deadlift, if I want to train at 85%, it's going to tell me that, 0.6 meters per second is 85% for the squat, right? Between 0.6 and 0.72 or something. And so that's kind of how I program those lifts. The Olympic lifts are a little bit tougher to do. And the reason why they're tougher to do is because of the way people catch and their different techniques, right? And so if you pull a weird way, the velocity is going to be slower the way you turn it over. So basically people base it off peak speed, but even then it's, for me personally, it's not as reliable as it is as a squat, bench, and deadlift. So I have kind of ranges the Olympic lifts that we like to use. We don't necessarily train the Olympic lifts for strength in that sense, right? Because then they'll start doing limbo catches and start spreading their legs out a bunch. The way I teach the Olympic lifts is far different than a lot of people do. We don't leave the ground at all. We get up really high up on our toes, and as we go to catch, we slam our heels into the ground. And why do we do it that way? Because I want them to, I learned this from Dan Lang, number one. Number two, I want them to feel the drive and the force into the ground and learn how to apply force from the ground into the barbell or into the implement to get that barbell up. Same thing we do in the throws. And so we don't leave the ground. We don't spread our legs. It's just up on the balls of our feet and down. And so they develop a really straight pull when they do that and how to apply force into the ground. So when we start trying to go too heavy, doing it that way, trying going too heavy, that's when they start spreading their legs. That's when their technique starts breaking down. And remember, our goal is not to, as throwers, our goal is, or as athletes for that matter, our goal is not to clean 200 kilos. Our goal is to use that lift to enhance our athletic ability. And in this sense, for throwing, it is to learn how to apply force into the ground and get it into your body and your implement. And that's what we're doing with these Olympic lifts. So when I program that, it's usually, between 1 meter per second and 1.5 meters per second for the Olympic lifts. For the squat, bench, and hex bar deads, it ranges as far as my charts. And I'd be happy to send those charts to you if you want to see those charts, no problem.
Now, do you use like Brian Mann charts, or have you doctored yours back some for high school athletes?
No, I don't use, I use Brian Mann's charts for the Olympic lifts, right? Like for what he kind of recommends for the Olympic lifts. But for the squat, bench, and deadlift type thing, I had a relationship with Push before they shut down, and now it's with Output. And there are scientific charts that have been tested and used where they have found that these speeds are correlated exactly to this percentage. And I tested it myself as far as my maxes and where I should be on 60%, what speed I should be at 80%. And they were really, really dead on. So that's where those charts come from. As far as I use Brian Mann stuff for Olympic lifts, and I use those charts, which I'm sure probably some of it came from Brian Mann for the squat, bench, and deadlift type stuff.
Listened to a few podcasts of yours, and I went back and I tried to read some of your articles on HMMR, along with a few other places that I'd found them. And you brought this up, and I thought it was really interesting in one of the articles. But meet distances should be better than practice throws. Is that due to the hype and the intensity the meet creates, as opposed to practice when you're just kind of grinding it out?
Personally, I believe yes. And let's talk about the Dr. B system for a second. I had a person, because we track our throws every day in training. I had a person who would throw really well in training and then get to a meet and psychologically not be as good as they should be. And so he didn't throw as well. So what is the answer to this? How am I really going to figure their pattern out if this is the way it's going to be? And so what I did during training is I said, okay, well, hey, this individual, these are your 3 throws that we're going to mark. And these are the ones that are going to count for our marking in our Excel spreadsheet. And as soon as I did that, I called their name up, so-and-so up, for those 3 throws. They didn't throw as well, right? Because psychologically, they had a hard time dealing with the competition aspect. Now, as a coach, you got to learn how to help them get better at that and recognize that. But as soon as I started doing that and started working on that, the pattern of peak form and whatnot, as far as following the patterns in the Excel spreadsheet, lined right up to the competition. Like, even though they were choking, they're still at peak form, so they were choking better, if that makes sense, right? And so, since they were choking better, I knew, okay, now what we really have to do is work on their mindset. And the best person in the world that, as far as throwing goes, that work on somebody's mindset in that matter is Dan Lane. So I learned a ton from him on how to do that. So I just know from experience, you're a really good competitor, you're going to get 2 to 3 feet in your competition throws versus your practice throws typically. Like, I knew if I knew I threw 18 meters in training, which I rarely did, I was going to go throw really far in the loop because I was a good competitor. Same thing with some of my athletes now, like Aja. She'll train at 13 meters and she'll throw 14, 15 in the meet, right? 14, 15, 14, 20 in the meet. So that helps me out. Same thing with Jessica. She'll train at 43 meters in training, and she'll throw 48 meters in the competition. So that's just a sign of a good competitor, somebody who thrives off of that.
So you can use that to determine which way to go more so than actually seeing a bigger distance, because some kids are going to react different from what you said. So now you can adjust your practice to fit that, like you said you did. So if you are getting big carryover because of the meet hype, do you want to keep your practices for those kids pretty low key so that you maintain that, or do you want to bring up the intensity so that the numbers line up better?
I keep it. That's a good problem to have, right, in my mind. So I kind of keep it the same. Now, what I do tell them is, if we can get you to train at this level during practice, is that going to enhance what you do during the meet? So that's always the question, right? And so at some point, I tell them all the time, look, I can get you in the right positions. I can tell you where you need to be, but ultimately it's up to you to compete and get the job done, right? And so there's certain things like the discus release or the shot release that I can show you how to do it, but a lot of it is feel on your neck, feel in your hand, feeling where it should be, that you have to make a personal adjustment and kind of study on your own on how to do that. So the competition aspect, that's a good problem to have. And when it's that side of the thing, I don't really worry too much about it. It's only the other side when they're not doing what they should be doing from practice to competition is what I worry about.
Now, for your younger athletes, I think you read that maybe you run a 1x20 for younger athletes, certain athletes. Did I read that right?
I run it for specific teams. So we have a really, really high quality basketball team at our school. And basketball players, in my experience, they don't necessarily like to lift all the time. And so some of them really love it. Some of them, the majority of them, maybe just do it because they're forced to be there. So what we try and do is we run that 1x20 because they get really good at doing those exercises, doing it 20 reps. And we do it 3 times a week. And so they get good at doing it. They get comfortable doing it. And they kind of learn to like it a little more. And it's not heavy, right? Basketball players think they lift heavy. It's going to mess their shot ups, things like that, right? They'll get sore, things like that. So typically with the basketball team, we'll start off with a 1x20 and we'll start transitioning into more traditional type stuff. But the good part about the 1x20 is you get good at what you're trying to do. Now, I have my own variation of it. The way I do it is we have an explosive movement. So that might be a jump, right? Followed by a core movement on the sagittal plane, followed by a injury prevention type prehab movement, followed by a lower body movement, followed by a upper body pull, followed by mobility, followed by a hinge hip, followed by upper body press, and then followed by another mobility movement. Now, that's the foundation of the first number of exercises, and we follow those all the way through 20 exercises, right? So 1 by 20 is 20 reps of about 18 to 21 exercises is what it comes down to. And so the next set of 9 movements will be on different plane, right? So I'm going to try to do an explosive movement on a different plane. So that might be a speed skater. And then my core movement will be on the frontal plane on that next round of exercises. And then on the next round of exercises, that core movement will be on the transverse plane. And so I alternate the planes within those 21 exercises of a core movement. I alternate the planes of the leg movement. So the first one might be a goblet squat. The second one might be a lateral step up. And the third one might be a rotational lunge. So we hit frontal plane, we hit sagittal plane, and we hit transverse plane. So that's my variation of the 1 by 20 and how we utilize it.
Okay, and I thought I'd read that, so I just wanted to at least touch on that. Now, managing the weight room time, how do you decide what the biggest bang for your buck is when you bring athletes in? Do you look at the sport? Do you look at the age? What are you taking into account?
I take into account this philosophy. The philosophy that your body is like a bicycle wheel full of spokes. And if one of those, although all the spokes may be very strong, if one of those spokes is weak and out of whack, then the whole wheel could collapse. And so the way we handle our training is we have 3 modules. And those 3 modules consist of 3 exercises that are supersetted or trisetted, however you want to explain it. The first module is an explosive movement, a core movement, and an injury prevention movement, kind of like what I talked about in 1 by 20. So we'll hit that for 3 sets, let's say. Then we have a module 2. We have a lower body movement, an upper body pulling movement, and a mobility movement. This mobility movement, okay, is going to prepare us for our pushing movement in the 3rd module. So usually that pushing movement in the 3rd module is a bench press or a dip, something along those lines. So we're going to do a chest opener. We're going to do a dynamic pec stretch. We're going to do a banded iron cross to prepare our shoulder girdle and our chest for that upper body pressing movement. Then our 3rd module is our hinge hip movement. And typically our hinge hip movement, we're always doing it on a single leg because that's how you play sport, right? We're not doing heavy RDLs. We're doing single leg RDLs with kettlebells or something along those lines. Followed by upper body press, which is bench. And then another mobility movement at the very end of that tricep. And that mobility movement is going to counter whatever we did with our lower body movement in module 2. And so what I mean by that is we're squatting typically. And so we're going to do a pigeon stretch. We're going to do a half kneeling external rotator stretch. We're going to do a Hawaiian squat, something to keep those IT bands, those glutes loose from squatting and trying to stay mobile. So if you look at the program, it's not about what's big bang for your buck. It's about keeping everything balanced. And so if you look at that, we cover all areas. We got an explosive movement. We got a core movement. We got a upper body pressing movement, upper body pulling movement, a hinge hip movement, and mobility movement. So everything's covered. And so that's our philosophy, and it's very efficient, and it runs through there. And a dude named Robert Dos Remedios, I kind of learned that from, and Shannon Turley kind of trained that way as well. And so that's kind of how I developed my philosophy, right? And so if we have 2 to 3 sessions a week, that first session will be more sagittal based. That second session will be more frontal based, and that third session will be more transverse based. And so we hit all 3 planes throughout the week, and we hit every part of, I guess, the exercise movement spectrum during those sessions.
Just looking over all your stuff and trying to read as much as I could and listen to everything. You got some great stuff out there. So trying to get all that into notes for a podcast was very difficult, and it covered a large spectrum. So thanks for kind of following along with me as I dipped and ducked and dived and weaved through all these different ideas. I really appreciate it. You seem to interpret them all very well, even though I know some of the questions weren't phrased very well.
No, this is great. I could talk shop all day long, as I'm sure people who are listening can tell. I'm just getting excited about doing it. Excited about telling what's worked for us, sharing about what's worked with us. And I'm a big Star Wars fan, and Yoda always says you must pass on what you learned. That's the most important thing. So people have passed on what they learned to me, and I'm trying to pass on what I've learned to others as well. Whether they agree with it or disagree with it, that's okay. One thing that's important to me is, especially in our political climate these days, Because I like to look at a coach and say, you know what, I wouldn't do it that way, but that guy does a good job and he gets good results. And they might look at me and say, that guy's full of shit. And but at the very least, they could say, well, he's full of shit, but for some reason he gets good results. So, and that's okay. I'd really like for, the world, let's say presidential candidates to be like, not attack their character, attack their policies, okay, but not attack their character, right? And so just because somebody doesn't do it the way you're going to do it, doesn't mean they're a bad person or that, they're wrong or whatever. It just means that they do it a different way and it's their choice and it's their perspective. And you have your perspective, they have their perspective, and that's what makes our place so great. We're allowed to do that.
That's the crazy thing about the podcast, right? When I started doing it, I had some strong beliefs in my head of how training should look or what you should be doing. But the more people you talk to, the more results you see out there that they're getting from different areas of training, different modalities. And you hopefully start looking at that more objectively so that I can use what I want to use. Or like you said, hey, I may not do it that way, but your athletes look happy, healthy, and you're having success. So yes, I agree with what you're saying there 100%.
And going back to the whole modules thing that I talked about, I presented this one year at Gain or Birmingham Ed is Gain. And there was kind of more of a bodybuilding type, muscle type, maximal strength guy there. And I knew I was going to get the question from him. I was preparing myself, and he's like, well, how are you supposed to get maximal rest in between things to enhance your squat or whatever? And if you look at it, because I'm sure people listening to this will probably ask the same question. If you really look at it, you start off with the explosive movement. So let's say that's a clean. And then you have a core movement supersetted with that. And let's say that is let's say ab wheel, just to make it simple. And then you have injury prevention with that. And typically I use knees over toe stuff a whole bunch in that area. And so we're doing our first round, we're going to do our tibialis raises. Our second round, we're going to hit our clean again. And we're going to hit our ab wheel again. Our third round, we're going to do our knee over toe calf raise. Our third round, we're going to hit our clean again. We're going to hit our ab wheel again. And then we're going to do our Patrick steps, right? And so if you really look at that, it's more active recovery in between the main lifts, because the tibialis raise and the ab wheel really isn't going to affect the clean at all. And you look at the next module of squat and upper body pulling movement. So we may safety squat followed by a gorilla row followed by a pec stretch. Well, the pec stretch is 30 to 45 seconds of stretching your pec, right? So you're not doing much there. The gorilla row really doesn't have a lot to do with what you're doing with your legs. So that's about 30 seconds of doing nothing with your legs. So you look at more as an active recovery. And so that's why all that stuff fits together nicely, because they really have nothing to do with the other thing. Does that make sense?
You're creating rest but you're also getting more done, because management in the high school weight room, from what I've learned, is the most important thing. So it's not like you're just hitting a place like I have where the kids can hang out for an unlimited amount of time and then get all the rest they want. No, you got them there for a certain amount of time, and you have to check as many boxes as you possibly can.
And doing it that way, what our new football coach can, like, I got to talk about our new football coach. This is his second year, does a really good job. I really like it, but I thought he was like at the very beginning. I was with the previous football coach for all 20 years. So he was 100% buy-in. And when he came in, it was like, am I still going to have a job working with football, etc.? And so he watched the first workout. And I go, what do you think? Better than you thought? Worse than you thought? I never thought it could be done this way. You're in charge. See you later. And that was it, right? Because he saw how efficient everything was. And what that allows us to do is, in training that manner, when nobody's standing around, everybody knows exactly what's going on. It takes some time to train, but it allows the other coaches not to have to sit in the way. They can go to do their meetings or the film work and things like that while I'm managing everything and making sure everything's right. And so the efficiency and the system in the weight room is most important, especially at a high school level, because you don't have the budget to have assistant at every rack, right? So that helps.
Well, Coach, I know you had a little excitement at your house this afternoon, and you still took time to do this, and I really appreciate it. Hopefully the questions were decent. I know I picked up quite a bit of information, so thank you very much for your time.
Yep, and if anybody has any questions about what we talked about, because I know we jumped around a lot, feel free to email me, and I always get back to people email. Sometimes it'll be right away. If it's a super in detail question, I'm going to give you the respect. You'll have to wait a few days, but I'm going to answer in how you deserve me to answer you, and give you the best answer possible as far as being detailed and whatnot. So it might take me a few days if it's one of those type of questions.
Well, I'm sure the listeners will appreciate that. I know a lot of them know who you are, so there may be some questions that come in.
Yeah, I've spoken at the Illinois clinic back in the day, the Track and Field Coaches Association clinic. So it was good. Ken Kemeny and whatnot was there, and so it was fun.
Well, Coach, like I said, I appreciate everything you did to make this podcast possible, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks, man. You too. And today, pleasure to be on and a privilege to be on. Thank you.
Thanks, man.